Initially, they claim it was an accident, or
First of all, they claimed, as if I remember correctly, they kind of were hinting that it was the U.S. that had done it.
Yep.
That they didn't know anything about it, that it was like a horrible thing. And then within 2 days, they pivoted and it was an accident. It was human error.
And by the way, we'll get to the direct quotes that kind of contradict some of this in a little bit. There's a lot here for everyone to go through. We're going to do our best to cover a 4-part series in under an hour. So buckle up. It's going to be quite a bit. So
it's going to be a wild ride.
That's right. So COVID kicks off, and this, like, why haven't you heard about this story? And let's start there, right?
Yeah.
Why haven't I heard about this story? One of the biggest atrocities to happen in Canadian history. The only bigger aviation accident, it's not an accident, but in that category, was the Air India bombing. And yet, the Canadian government's position is that this was an unintentional act. Mm-hmm. And the RCMP refuses to open a criminal investigation into the matter. So let's start at the very top, I guess, with RCMP.
So yeah. Maybe we should start with, first of all, a little bit of the chronology. So we have to take you all the way back to the pandemic, or like before the pandemic, if anybody can remember that far back. Like, really, was there anything before the pandemic? That was before time, right?
That's when time stopped.
Something happened. I don't know. But so January 2nd, if we can take people's memories back, 2nd, 3rd, can't remember now. The U.S. assassinated, Major General Qasem Soleimani, who was like a big wig in the IRGC, which is the Iranian military. Trump had him assassinated, and Iran was not happy about that. There were escalating tensions because of it. And then Iran had done attacks on U.S. interests in Iraq because Soleimani was killed in Baghdad, Iraq. So you get to sort of not even really fast forward, just, a hop and a skip forward to January 8th. And that morning, there's a plane leaving the Tehran airport in Iran. It's a passenger plane, a lot of Canadians, it's 85, I believe. Yeah, it was 85 people that live in Canada, citizens and permanent residents. So there was only something like 90 something others from other countries left on it. So most of the passengers are Canadian, sadly, but that's the situation here, right? So Iran shoots down that airplane and pretty close to immediately start saying, oh, it was an accident.
We got to back that up a little bit. They had fired rockets into American military bases in the hours before this plane was shot down.
Yeah.
In the early hours of that morning, January 8th, they fired rockets into Iraq, into American military bases, some which had Canadians stationed there. So Then there's an expectation, right, that there's going to be retaliation from the United States. That sets up what happens next, and that is, I'll let you take it from here and we'll get back into it. It's going to bounce around. There's a lot going on here we're trying to lay out.
There is, and we're trying not to get to the punchline right away because it's big and it's interesting. So from what we are knowing at that time, January 8th, 2020, wee small hours of the morning, the Ukrainian Airlines PS752 gets shot down by 2 Iranian missiles shortly after takeoff. Like, the whole flight was 7 minutes?
Yeah, I don't know what the exact transmission is, but basically took off. It was at less than 6,000 feet altitude, roughly, or it was in around there when it was shot. And so it was still in the midst of taking off, basically. So it would have been, within the first 5 or 6 minutes.
And from my understanding, if I remember everything correctly, the one missile hits, the plane starts turning around to come back to the airport. And that's when the second missile hits within 30 seconds. I mean, I've heard different numbers, anywhere from 23 to 30 seconds, but I mean, that's insignificant. It's in less than a minute, another missile is shot at it. It winds up, this ball of flames and crashes into a park outside of a village.
And so let's start maybe at the scene.
Where do we start now?
I mean, there's so much to go into. So at that scene, one of the things that comes up was that they looted essentially the bodies. So I'm just going to pull up the direct quote if I can. Oh, where to go? We don't need the direct quote, but basically, it was IRGC was the last on site, and before they got there, right? There's theories around why they were last on site, like maybe that was intentional, but the belongings were looted, and essentially anything of value was gone. But also at the same time, that is evidence leaving the crash site.
Exactly.
So that's the crash is. It's a horrible event, but that's not where the story lies. The story lies kind of around the government's handling of this and the RCMP's handling of it. So let's start with maybe the RCMP. On this, they refused to open a criminal investigation into the matter. They cited some interesting things about why that is, but I'll let you take it from here and I'll get those quotes ready.
Okay, so one of the things to understand is that it is two separate investigations. There's the criminal investigation and there's the crash investigation. The crash investigation, according to international law, would go to, like, the first investigators would be the place where the plane crashed, which would be Iran, but Iran shot it down. So the next one in line to do an investigation would be the place, the country where the plane was registered, which was Ukraine. So they would take the lead in this investigation. That is a separate thing. They're looking at what caused the crash, what exactly happened, what the inspiration is, the who, what, why, where's, and when's about that. The criminal investigation is a separate thing. And that, I think, is where we need to talk about the Criminal Code of Canada.
Yeah. Okay. So do you have more of the details in front of you on the criminal code specifically? Of course not. So I'm underprepared, just for the record, on this today, but we'll just, in generic terms, this is coming. We've spoken with former RCMP officer Andy Brooke, and talking about this. The criminal code definitely gives us jurisdiction to investigate this. In fact, Ukraine, when we consider that they're at war, not just at war, but the Ukraine International Airlines, here's something most people don't know. Ukraine International Airlines, airliner involved in the downing, is using the Ontario court system to sue Iran. But they're in a great position to investigate this, according to the RCMP. In personal communications that we had with the RCMP, we asked a couple of, we'll just give the generic rundown. I said, listen, the prosecutor general, they were just fired over treason concerns. Ukrainian International Airlines, they're using our courts to sue Iran. And then they're at war. Do you guys still have confidence in them? And by the way, I didn't give that all up front. I kind of led them into, you still have confidence in Ukraine? And they went, you know what? We have the utmost confidence in Ukraine. I'm paraphrasing. This isn't a direct quote. I believe I have it included in one of my articles, but they say, yes, we have the utmost confidence in Ukraine, despite all this, to continue this investigation. That's your RCMP's official position. Yes. So you got Brenda Lucky and the political interference allegations coming out of Nova Scotia, all the different officers that are continuing to throw her under the bus. I am getting ahead of myself. And then
it's super exciting. This is it's a horrible tragedy, but it's exciting that we have this story and nobody's talking about it. So we need to get this information out to the Canadian public, because it's showing that the Trudeau Liberal government has corrupted the RCMP, which is supposed to be protecting Canadian citizens. And I mean, there's a lot to unpack there, but again, let's look at this, because we got to go back in time in our heads, right? I mean, it feels like forever, but January 8th, the plane goes down. Everybody's crying for justice. They don't know what happened, which is understandable. This horrible thing happens. Everybody's getting their head around it. They're trying to figure out what happens. 4 months later, on April 18th, is where the mass shooting happens in Nova Scotia. So we have two tragedies that happened at the first part of 2020. And yet the things that we're talking about, it's like all about COVID because we were locked down in March. So all of those happened in a very short, condensed period of time. The tragedies that happened didn't get a lot of airtime. They didn't get a lot of attention. And normally what happens when something like that goes on, the media will take that story and they will put pressure on the government so that the government does something. It never really happened with PS752. It happened a little bit with Nova Scotia because the families were outraged at some of the stuff that was going on. So they got a little bit more traction. And because, of course, gun laws came in, which created a whole nother thing, and it's just a mess. But do we want to do this chronologically?
I don't think we can. I mean,
Okay.
it's really tough to do chronologically when you get into the different things. You can try.
Well, it's just because December 2020 is when the next big thing happens with the RCMP, because that was when...
Yeah, you've been putting these timelines together, and I've just been absorbed in the details of my series. So this is where, like, I can't even follow, per se, the chronological side because you've been putting together that timeline. I haven't.
The whole thing is crazy, and it just keeps, like, firing stuff off in my head. So...
Yeah, and so, okay, I guess we're back track here.
So
Let's go.
We'll try to do it chronologically. So, okay, so we have those two major tragedies, and then fast forward to December of 2020, and there's a clandestine meeting with one of the family members of two of the victims and the RCMP. Take it away.
So that what she is referring to is part 4 of our series. And then if you want to look at this article, I highly recommend you do. Article is titled Trudeau Government Blatantly Lied. Source within Iran says PS752 was shot down with the intention to blame the United States of America. So Shaheen Moghadam is one of the family members that lost somebody in this crash. He lost his wife Shakiba and he lost his son Rostam. And realistically, it can't go without being said, he lost his life that day.
Mm-hmm.
I can't imagine to be in that position. So that's the starting point. And I would add, before we really even get into this, until people care about this as much as until the people that aren't affected by this care as much as the people that are affected by it, there will be no justice.
Yeah.
Shaheen Moghadam had a conversation with a senior Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps source in December of 2020, specifically December 2nd of 2020. We'll get to why that's important here in a minute. But in the handoff of the evidence, let's just go through some of what he actually went through to get this evidence into the hands of the RCMP.
So, and just let me back up just shortly here, just to re-emphasize, the families have basically been on their own. There's not a lot of media attention. There's not a lot of attention from the government. So they have had to chase down sources and try to get justice on their own because they have nobody else who's fighting in their corner. So I just want to make that really clear that, they have really had to do a lot of the legwork here. So getting this information to the RCMP was incredibly important to Shaheen and the other family member, or the other, family members of the victims.
Yeah, and just on a touch, like the Prime Minister, to keep this in context, looked these people in the eye, hugged them, took pictures with them, said, I will not stop. I will not rest until I get justice and accountability. Okay? This Prime Minister looked grieving families in the eye and said, I will not stop until I get justice. Let's start there. Shaheen goes through this extenuating circumstances just to get this evidence and give it to the RCMP. In that handoff, he's first instructed to go to a plaza by his house. Once there, he receives a call from the RCMP. He's then told to go to Major Mackenzie and Home Depot. This is in Toronto, Vaughan. Referring to a Home Depot location located at 55 City View Boulevard in Vaughan, just in case you think we're making up the details here. After arriving at this location, the RCMP called Mr. Mogadam again. They then instructed him to go to the Rutherford GO station parking lot. RCMP, you're more welcome to correct the record on the record. Like we've reached out to you. You can correct us if we're wrong, but you're not gonna. We know that based on the canned responses you're giving us. But I'm going.
We have the names of at least some of the RCMP officers in attendance.
And I'll name them for this show here as we get through them. So he goes to the Rutherford GO station. At this time, an RCMP van came and picked him up. He says, a van came and they said, okay, now we take you from here by our car. And then we went in a hotel in Highway 7 and 404. That's a direct quote. That's why the language isn't great. The meeting took place in a hotel across from the IKEA located at 200 Interchange Way in Vaughan. Mr. Mogadam, he isn't entirely sure which hotel it was, but he believes it to be the Courtyard by Marriott located at 150 Interchange Way where the meeting took place. A location just 0.3 miles from the IKEA parking lot located at 200 Interchange Way. Now, this is where it gets interesting. Now Shaheen describes basically what is a spy thriller. And he goes, when I get there, there's approximately 6 to 10 RCMP personnel present at this meeting. And this included officers Johnson and McDonald. We don't know the ranks. According to Mr. Mogadam, the RCMP had 2 different rooms set up within the hotel to be able to receive the information. He says one room, it was like monitor and computer stuff with 2-3 people in it or 4 people in it, and 1-2 people in lobby, and about 3-4 people in the interview room. So they have 2 different rooms set up to receive this information. They went to this length just to receive it. Now, former RCMP officer Andy Brooke has covered this. This is typical counter surveillance. It was to protect the RCMP, to make sure Shaheen's not leading anybody to them, and to make sure he's not being followed. Standard procedure. But it's worth noting, just in case anybody goes, oh, that's weird, that's out of place. It's not. So he hands this evidence to them at the first meeting, and it's not all of the evidence. It's on a USB. It's placed in an evidence bag and sealed. Within 3 to 4 days, another meeting's requested by the RCMP. They want to receive the rest of the information.
So at this junction, I just want to point out, if it was something that was like a total crank, the RCMP wouldn't have come back 3 or 4 days later insisting on having the original transcript.
Yep.
They would have been like,
they would have said, "Nope, we're not interested. This isn't information that's reliable. We believe whatever." Any number of things.
In any way, so like it's just garbage. But
they looked at the information, and then 3 to 4 days later, they request the rest of it. So there's something to it.
Yes.
The second meeting takes place at the residence of Mr. Mogadam. At this meeting, the RCMP is given the full transcript of a call between Mr. Mogadam and an IRGC member. What's unusual about this meeting is that the RCMP had asked Mr. Mogadam to sign a written consent form to share the information with Ukrainian authorities. He refused because he advised the RCMP he did not trust the Ukrainian investigation and he was only sharing this information with them. He doesn't know what's happened to this information since. Alex Pearson had him on. You can check out her show. He talks to this a little bit in detail. Mr. Andy Brooke, former RCMP officer, is on that show as well as lawyer, solicitor, and barrister, our barrister and solicitor, rather, Rami Joubin. Now, Mr. Brooke had a comment on the request of the RCMP because they asked Mr. Mogadam to sign a consent form to share information with Ukraine. Mr. Brooke describes this as procedurally unusual. And he added, frankly, it is odd and raises question about the nature of the documents that were presented to a person with limited English language capabilities. So that's just extra detail, like kind of just weirdness about this. It's not even per se you need to know knowledge, but it adds to this whole picture here. Other RCMP officers that were known to be involved in the handoff of this evidence, either at meetings 1 or 2, were Angie McDonald, Constable Daniel Sturgis, and Constable Scott Williamson. The ranks of the officers have been specified where they're known. So he goes about getting this evidence in their hand. Now let's go back to the dates. When did they get this evidence? December 2nd of 2020. Okay. Now, why is that important? The Yaworski report comes out June 24th of 2021. The government parrots this report incessantly. This is their go-to. Okay.
Well, and the RCMP had keep referring you back to the Yaworski report. So
they directly referred me back to the Yaworski report. I said, do you have this evidence? And they said, look at the Yaworski report. Thanks for the non-answer, RCMP. So they have this evidence, December 2nd of 2020, they're giving it. Okay. June 24th of 2021, the Yaworski report comes out from the government. They parrot this report constantly. It says, we found no evidence of premeditation. Okay. But you were given evidence on December 2nd of 2020 indicating that this was premeditated. So if you didn't find the evidence, that might be clever wordplay. I didn't see it. My little girl likes to play that game too.
If I didn't see it, it doesn't exist.
I don't know. It must not exist. I have found no evidence.
And we have to point out, when was the Ontario court case?
Ontario court case was before that. There was was it before that? When was the settlement? There's a $107 million settlement. My dates are all messed up here. I've really narrowed in on my 4-part series, and I got it. We'll get broader here.
Somewhere in there, in this time frame, there is a civil suit brought by some of the families against Iran. And in that court case, Judge, I can't say his name, Bellababa?
Bellababa.
Thank you. He finds, and I don't know if you know this, because I got a little extra information earlier today. He found that it was a terrorist attack. That is what he has declared it as. Now, this judge has done that because he also, either himself personally or the lawyer for the plaintiffs, there is somehow this information got to the judge directly from the source.
I didn't know that. Source,
yeah, okay.
Hey, well, that's an interesting tidbit. Okay.
Isn't it, though? Okay. So the information came directly, and apparently there's something like this source apparently has a lot of documentation, let's just say, that he would be willing to provide so long as he can do it safely. Because obviously, in his situation, he would be potentially at great danger, which is why we have to be very careful about what we say about this source.
Yeah, and it is worth noting, we are actively watching or monitoring our language around this because we are trying to protect the source. It isn't, these aren't games. The IRGC would love it if the people that are singing right now would go away. And so without going into detail, we need to be careful with this information. Addressing the evidence itself, right? Maybe it's garbage evidence. Right? That's fair. But they didn't say that. They said there was no evidence. We found no evidence. Okay, now it's a lie. You blatantly lying to Canadians.
Exactly, and yet we have a judge in Ontario who found evidence.
Now, worth noting, that was a civil suit, not criminal. It is a balance of probabilities, not beyond a reasonable doubt. So you could make the argument there that, okay, still wasn't, whatever. But based on the balance of probabilities, Justice Bellababa looked at this evidence, or the evidence that was presented by the lawyers, and said, yeah, I think it was an intentional act of terrorism. Direct quote. Mm-hmm. So around the evidence itself, we don't know, is it reliable? We don't know. But at the end of the day, they said it doesn't exist, and to our knowledge, it hasn't been pursued or followed up on at all. So how can you say it's not reliable evidence? How can you say it's not worth pursuing?
There's no evidence whenever it has been presented, and it was good enough for a judge in Ontario. And now they want to, the Canadian government want that ruling thrown out.
Yeah, so and let me talk about that a little bit. Oh my goodness, I forgot how much I've covered on this. So they're at the point, they get a $107 million judgment awarded because it was an intentional act of terrorism. Now they're going to seize assets on a default motion. I'm maybe not getting the legal jargon quite right. Apologize if it's not. Go look at the articles. I made sure it was right there. In doing so, the counsel for the Attorney General of Canada, who hasn't even sought official intervening status on this case, meaning they haven't even sought to actually be a part of the proceedings in any way, shape, or form, asked that the judge dismiss the motion for default judgment because they said Iran still has state immunity, of diplomatic immunity over these things. Even though the State Immunity Act says state sponsors of terrorism don't get those perks and betties, i.e. Syria and Iran. Those are the two countries that are listed specifically. So they don't get those perks. But here is the counsel for the Attorney General of Canada, Jacqueline Dice-Visca, in her factum for the Attorney General of Canada. She asked that it be dismissed. So the government's fighting for justice and accountability. Meanwhile, the counsel for the Attorney General says, dismiss that. We don't want them seizing the assets. They're still diplomatically protected. Why?
Yeah, who is the Canadian government actually protecting and fighting for? Is it the citizens of this country, or is it for foreign interests?
Now let's lay out Occam's razor argument, why and how I look at this. Since before Trudeau was ever elected, he campaigned on something that you really need to be aware of. And that was that he was not going to be Mr. Harper. He was not going to run his foreign policy based on ideological reasons. I was going to be Mr. Practical, he said. And I'm going to reestablish, wait for it, relations with Iran. I'm going to reestablish an embassy in Iran. Platform promise before he's elected. Platform promise. 2016, his foreign minister, Stefan Dian, comes out and basically goes on a bitch fit campaign where he goes, it sucks. Nothing good has come out of this since the closure of the embassy. Terrible that we still have to rely on Italy for our relations with Iran. And then there's the heat. 2018, there's a motion, right? There's some heat driven up by the Conservative Party about listing a certain IRGC entity as a terrorist entity. Trudeau agrees to this motion.
It passed.
But guess what?
Immediately added to the list.
Immediately. But are they a listed member of the terrorist entity? Are they listed? No, 4 years later, Trudeau signs a motion. Motions don't mean crap, everyone. A motion is like, I promise I'll do better, maybe. And then that's what it was.
We've got this list that hasn't been added to. So
and then on top of that, every subsidiary organization of Iran, like the Al-Quds Force, there's all these subsidiary organizations that are listed as terrorist entities, but they won't list the IRGC as a terrorist entity. Then the question comes around, well, let's ask the question, Occam's razor. If they pursue a criminal investigation, is it likely or is it unlikely that we'll be able to reestablish embassy relations in Iran? Is it likely or unlikely that if they were found criminally culpable, which they guarantee, we know they fired 2 missiles, which I think that already puts them in the guilty side of things. Is it likely or unlikely that they're going to get the embassy relations reestablished? Or that the IRGC, because the IRGC, is it likely or unlikely that they get listed rather as a terrorist entity at that point if they're found criminally culpable? Well, I think they're probably going to be listed as a terrorist entity because I don't think you'll have a choice. So what do you do if you're Mr. Trudeau and you want to reestablish embassy relations in Iran? We don't know. But, man, it sure seems like he's kicking this down the road. He says he's going to fight for justice and accountability. And then his counsel for the Attorney General is trying to throw out the default motion for judgment against Iran. And then they won't open a criminal investigation. There's all these things he's doing that just, it really seems counterintuitive if you're really adamant about fighting for justice and accountability. So Occam's razor, what's more likely? Is this being kicked down the road because that's the only way that this stays alive? Who knows? But we do know this was a campaign promise of the Trudeau government to reestablish embassy relations with Iran. And then this happened. So,
and they wanted to do that despite security concerns in Tehran.
And they acknowledged that there was security concerns in Tehran, and they still wanted to go forward with it. That's the mentality of this government. This is where their mind frame is around this issue. Now we can go into, I guess, some statements made by the IRGC source as well. These are hard to read. One of the most chilling statements that was made suggested that a passenger plane was to be targeted. Quote, unfortunately, the unlucky lottery has fallen on this passenger plane. The source added that the number of Iranian passengers on the plane, quote, created the illusion for them that they will eventually confuse the issue with a technical error, which they did.
Mhm.
Iran attacked the U.S. military bases early that morning. We remember that. They said, this is the one that again, anybody thinking about this, I don't get how we accepted Iran's version of events. Here's another direct quote. Quote, because we know the subject and we know the mechanism of it, referring to standard operating procedures of the missile battery system that shot down PS752. And what did they say? What happened was impossible. This is evidence that didn't exist according to the Canadian government. They ignored it in the Yaworski report, said there's we found no evidence of premeditation. And this source, December 2nd, 2020, they were given this. June 24th, 2021, they come out with the report that says no evidence. What did the source say? We know the subject and we know the mechanism of it. What happened was impossible. I'm paraphrasing. That's not quite a direct quote. Now, why did this member come out and say this? They're pissed. They were under the impression that this was an American attack on them. They thought the Americans had shot down the plane, but when they realized it was their government, they knew the tone changed. The IRGC member became unsettled with the situation, and he said Azbadah's confession and press release, which he accepted after repeatedly denying facts, stated on national television this was a human error. So they're mad. They knew it wasn't a human error. That's when they knew the story wasn't lining up, because head of civil aviation for Iran comes out and says it was a mistake. It was a technical error. No, it wasn't. We know that was impossible. You get the anger, right? And our citizens are on there, our compatriots. And you shot them down with the intention that the United States would be shooting rockets back at you and you'd be able to blame them. You think I'm going too far with this? Direct quotes again. As whispers, it intensified among the forces. Why this flight? Why this plane? Why did it fly? End quote. Addressing the question, the source said, quote, since Russia has warm relations with Iran and Khamenei, the choice of target was definitely made in coordination with Russia. Source added that, quote, it certainly was not ineffective and not a role. They also list numerous sources of military sources, members rather, that were at a meeting either the night before or early hours of the morning. Time frame is not completely clear, but they list names of these people that were at the meeting, including Major General Hossein Salami. I'm going to butcher names, so I apologize. Chief of the IRGC, Brigadier General Hossein Ashtari, Commander of the Law Enforcement Forces, IRGC, Major General Golem Ali Rashid, Chief, we got other ones, Major General Hassani Sadi, and Deputy Chief KCHQ Artesh Regular Forces. In total, the source listed 29 names. According to the source, direct quote again, an important decision had to be made in the military discussion, end quote. And the presence of top-ranking military personnel in the country that were invited and attended this meeting as a result. Now, their direct quote, this in itself shows that this work was planned in advance. And they knew and were informed. And these people were gathered with the knowledge of this issue. And then another direct quote here again, I'm continuing. All of this behavior suggests that all of this was a plot and a plan. And in fact, not and coincidental. That's a direct quote, obviously not grammatically correct. The source elaborated, stating, direct quote again, I mean, the number of people that I just mentioned to you, whom all have military affiliation, raises a big question on the night of the incident by itself. Doesn't exist according to the RCMP. Doesn't exist according to the government of Canada. That's why this matters. Yes. 85 people with ties to Canada perished.
They were living in Canada. These are people who are Canadian. They live here. Like, they are here. They are our neighbors, our friends, the guy who works down the street. These are people we know. They are our people.
Karen, wouldn't be surprised if this live is being censored. That being said, if you are currently watching this live stream, please share this out directly to direct message people that you think might be interested in the information. That will go a long way. We know we're being censored. I know definitively we're being censored because people that get lots of traction on things they post are saying, hey, when I share your stuff, it gets no traction. Then I'll share something else. It gets lots of traction. Yeah, we know it's happening. It's almost like they don't want information like this getting out there. Who knows? Could have been flagged for a number of reasons. Maybe we said scandal. Maybe we had a picture of Trudeau. Any number of reasons they could have said, let's censor and throttle back their accounts. But that's all conspiracy tinfoil hat stuff. It doesn't happen. Clearly, censorship on a tech level never happens. Don't need
censorship, right? LC11? You know, it's already kind of being enacted before it's actually been passed. But anyway, that's a whole nother story.
and the direct quote on the belongings, just to bring this back up, he said, all the items and belongings of the passengers were actually stolen from their bodies in large quantities. That's another direct quote. Now, why did this
come back to like the beginning of the show when we were talking about how the IRGC were the last on the scene?
Yeah, and arguably, no, let's just go through it. The source said the IRGC was the very last, quote, very last force that entered the scene, to which the source added, quote, later found out was all intentional and planned, meaning it was not a coincidence. Why would you want the IRGC last on site? Well, all the items and belongings of the passengers were actually stolen from their bodies in large quantities. Then they show up, oh, the evidence is gone. Whoopsie daisies.
Mm-hmm.
Whoops. Well, that was a lot, stuff happens, guys. And it's almost like, didn't they bulldoze the site within like 5 or 6 hours too? It's like they wanted the evidence to be preserved. Like, I think they really wanted a proper investigation to be done. That's why they bulldozed the site.
Definitely. They just, they've done everything to protect that evidence. I mean, they are the ones that are supposed to be the main ones doing the investigation. And it looks more like they were possibly wanting to make sure there wasn't anything left to investigate.
It would almost seem that way, wouldn't it? But, it was all a coincidence. They had wanton disregard for human life. Accidents happen. It doesn't make it okay. They were negligent, but it wasn't intentional.
Hey, I got it. It was Trump's fault.
Yeah, Orange Man bad. Done.
There we go. End of story. That's it. We're over. That's all it is.
So now, why would this source risk their life? Now, here's the flip side of this. We found no evidence. IRGC sources risking their life to get this information out. And then, why would they do that? Why would they do that? Direct quote. But the fact that why I decided to talk with you, I really want to help and to achieve justice. And that those who make this terrible decision and played a role should be brought to justice and punished for their actions. Kudos to them. Senior member within the IRGC really put themselves out there to get this information even out of the country. And their life is at risk right now, potentially, because of this information. But our government says it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Now, RCMP got back to me, and they acknowledged the Nasira complaint, right? That was the one they did acknowledge. So we know about.
Well, we should explain that.
Yeah. Okay. So there is a complaint against. Everybody's talking about the political interference coming out of Nova Scotia. That's interesting.
That's huge news there just, a minute ago.
But what they don't know is that she's already under a pending code of conduct investigation for her refusal to open a criminal investigation into the downing of what flight? This flight, PS752. They initially, the coalition, there's some people involved. Go to Andy Brooks' page. he has information there. Explain it better
He's
than
on
I can.
Twitter, and you can just follow his Twitter feed, and he's amazing. So I think it's Andy Brook at Limestone, or no, Andy Brook Limestone, something to that effect.
We'll find it. So they take this complaint, they go to the Civilian Review and Complaint Commission, CRCC. And this is just a civilian board that's kind of like a watchdog of the RCMP. Or like for civilians to report complaints about the RCMP. They then elevate it to the level of the National Security Intelligence Review Agency, NSIRA, because it was deemed to have national security implications. Now I'm going to pull up the chairperson of the Civilian Review and Complaints Commission, the letter that was received from them. It reads, subsection 4553 4.1 of the Canadian Royal Mounted Police Act, RCMP Act, required the CRCC to refuse to deal with any complaint that is closely related to national security. Furthermore, the CRC must refer such complaints to the National Security and Intelligence Review Agency. Therefore, given that your complaint is closely related to national security, it was referred to NSIRA on September 16, 2021 for whatever action it deems appropriate. So again, let's touch on this. If it had no merit, they wouldn't have elevated it. They would have said, send it back to them. There's nothing here. Sorry, not sorry. But they didn't do that. They elevated to the National Security Intelligence Review Agency, and they say, there's national security implications here, and that is why we can't handle it. Does anybody know this, Canada? Do you know your RCMP commissioner's already under a pending code of conduct investigation? And then we know about Nova Scotia and political interference allegations? Right? This isn't the first time. This is the second time.
So Nova Scotia happens. We find out just 2 months ago that our dear commissioner, Brenda Lucki, was heavily trying to influence the investigation, even though it could have jeopardized that investigation to reveal the information. She was putting pressure on them.
Small price to pay.
So that they could push gun laws. Now, let's just a little taste of the gun situation in Canada for anybody who's not from Canada. We have some of the strongest, strictest gun rules in the world. People can have a gun in Canada. There are 2 licenses that you can get, the PAL and the RPAL, which is, what is it? I can never get them right. Anyway, the PAL is like for your regular license. The RPAL is for a restricted type of gun. Now, a lot of people who do hunting or shoot for sport, there's all kinds of things that people will do with guns. Farmers need them. Like in this country, you're out in the wild, you're at least 2 hours away from town. Good luck getting an RCMP out there or somebody out there if something's going on in your property. Like it's just not going to happen. You'd be dead before anything were to happen. Like before the police or anything would come. You need that kind of personal protection. Now, do things happen out in the country? Not a lot, but there are sometimes some stuff that does happen. So there's that kind of stuff that goes on. Plus, like you get coyotes in your yard, you get, bears sometimes, moose, this is like a huge country with a lot of wild spaces, okay? So you kind of need your weaponry. Now, Canadian gun owners tend to be incredibly safe because, get this, they have a criminal records check that is done on them every single day. They have to carry that RPAL or PAL license with them 24/7. Their gun and or whatever firearm and their bullets, their ammunition have to be kept separately. They cannot be taken together. Like there's all kinds of these little rules that happen. Now, we do have gun crime in Canada, but you know what? It's not the people who have their PAL and their RPAL that are committing it. The guy in Nova Scotia had smuggled guns from the United States. That is where the gun crime in Canada comes from. It is from guns smuggled into the country illegally. But instead of addressing that problem, they go after legal gun owners that shoot for sport or for protection of their property from usually animals or to go hunting or whatever. I mean, these are good people.
And you bring that back around, was willing to jeopardize an ongoing investigation to help with pending gun control legislation. At least that's the story as it's unfolding according to multiple sources.
Yes.
Then you find out within like a tight time frame, they also refused to open a criminal investigation into 55 Canadian citizens being murdered at the hands of Iran. And they say, this was the part that killed me, that Ukraine's qualified because originally they said they have access to the crash, the witnesses, and they have better, basically, ability to conduct the investigation. Here's where it's hilarious. It was either part 1 or part 2. The prosecutor general of Ukraine literally put out a statement that was the complete opposite of what the RCMP claimed. RCMP, they're more qualified because they have access to the witnesses, the crash site, etc. Ukraine comes out and they're like, you know what? Despite the fact that we didn't have access to the witnesses, the crash site, or the other bits, like it wasn't as good as we would have liked it, didn't hinder our investigation. So RCMP gets completely contradicted by Ukraine. And then additionally, what was a recent development? Oh, war. So they're at war. And then I messaged the RCMP media relations and they said, get ready for it. We still have the utmost confidence in Ukraine. And they cited Malaysia airline downing because they conducted themselves so well. And it's like, were they at war then? Was the prosecutor general fired over treason concerns? Was your courts in such shambles that the Ukrainian International Airlines felt the need to use our court system to sue Iran? Yeah. They still said utmost confidence in Ukraine to conduct the investigation. That's what the RCMP is like under Commissioner Lucky right now.
Yes. So, and remember, these two incidents happened 4 months apart. The downing of the plane, the mass shooting, 4 months apart.
And it matters because if she's willing to potentially, again, it's not definitive, but potentially interfere in an ongoing political investigation to benefit the Trudeau government on pending gun control legislation, didn't Trudeau really want to reestablish embassy relations in Iran? And would them not opening a criminal investigation make that more likely to be possible? Because again, they shot rockets at this plane. We know they did. It's been proved. That one's known. That's a criminal act. And by the way, who buys this freaking story? The government of Canada has accepted the fact that Iran accidentally we misaligned this battery unit 105 degrees. And it sat there for like 3-4 hours without anyone noticing that it was completely misaligned. And then we mistook this jet that's, like 15 times the size of a cruise missile, and flies at maybe half the speed. The altitude was off. And we just, we thought it was an American missile. That's why we fired not 1, but 2 for sure. By the way, the IRGC source alludes to 3 and says there was 1 didn't go off. Mm-hmm. This is the scenario. Like, it is unbelievable that this isn't even being talked about. And what's frustrating is 55 Canadian citizens died. And I hate to pull the race card, but if COVID hadn't happened, or I would add, if they were not minorities who struggled to speak English in a way that was palatable to most people, and I'm not any slight on them at all, but the story is not getting the coverage it deserves. They're not getting the attention. Right now, is it today he's supposed to arrive, Mirzad? The March for Justice.
Oh.
Or he's still going, right?
Well, I guess they're not coming through Kingston, so I can't go.
Yeah. But right now, one of the fathers, Mirzad Zari, he lost his 18-year-old son, Arad, in the shootdown. He is marching, was it from Toronto? I think Toronto. Yes. Toronto to Ottawa currently. This is my example of what I mean by, like, if they were maybe English speakers first, we would get the coverage. It's barely being touched. CBC Power and Politics did like a 2-3 minute segment on it, or maybe 4-minute segment on it. That's basically been the only coverage I've seen in English. The rest is in Farsi. He's in the midst of this massive march, and he wants Majinsky sanctions against Iran, and they want the IRGC listed as a terrorist entity, and is barely making a blip in any coverage. This is the issue. Until people that aren't involved in this, aren't impacted, care enough to like actually get this into the limelight, these people will never get justice. And I can tell you, I'm getting emotional, as somebody who spent time on the phone with these people and has heard their stories, I don't know how you look them in the eye and say, we're going to fight for you. We're going to pursue justice and accountability. And then you pull out the knife and you stab it right in their back. And you smile while you do it. That's the Trudeau way.
Yeah.
Let's, sorry.
It's an awful thing that's happening. These are, again, they are our fellow countrymen, and we are supposed to be Canada, where we are an open and welcoming kind of a country. And we're always talking about that. Now it's time to put the rubber on the road. Like,
a Canadian's a Canadian's a Canadian. If we damn well mean that, we need to be outraged for them in that community. Because they're outraged, I promise you. They're fighting tooth and nail to be heard. I promise you.
They are on their own on this. I mean, we're doing everything that we can to bring attention to this. But where is the CBC? Where is CTV? Where is Global? These are the big broadcasters in our country, and they aren't looking into this at all. They have been, people have requested them to come and talk to them. They won't do anything. They're not looking at any of this stuff. They're not putting any pressure on the government whatsoever. And that is their job. As journalists, that's what they're supposed to do. They are supposed to be the ones that push the government to do the right thing, to hold the government to account. That is what journalism has been about forever. That's their purpose. That is their job and their responsibility. And they have completely neglected it, just as the RCMP possibly screwing up a case with like one of the worst mass shootings. No, actually, it's the worst mass shooting in Canadian history. And they're willing to screw that case to get some legislation pushed through that does nothing about crime anyway. They're willing to completely ignore the fact that the crash investigation is different from the criminal investigation, and they do have every right to make a criminal investigation. If a Canadian is murdered outside of Canada, they have the responsibility to investigate.
You're damn right they do.
There is a terrorist act outside of Canada, if that would be something that would be punishable in Canada, they have a responsibility to pursue an investigation. Now, these are different things, and it should be followed through. And to say that there isn't any kind of evidence, that there was no evidence to that this was, I can't think of words now.
Why?
It just infuriates me that this is not being investigated and it's not being covered and nobody's taking responsibility for it. And these poor families are left to fend for themselves. And there has been pressure put on them from Iran. There has been pressure put on people.
Can I speak to that? Sorry.
Never have happened.
Conversation I had with Shaheen. He goes, do you want to know the protection the RCMP offered? He's getting threats from the IRGC. And they said, call back if anything happens. If anything happens. Yeah, well, yeah. So, like, if you're in imminent danger, give us a call. We'll be there in 20, 30 minutes.
Yeah.
That's the protection they offer these people that are putting their lives on the line potentially to get this information out. And we're running low on time. We've got about 10 minutes. I want to get something else in. Here's the letter from the RCMP Commissioner Lucky that Mr. Juban was referring to, part 3. Go check it out. This is a 4-part series. You need to read it if you want to get a vibe of how dark this story is. You need to go 1 through 4. Here's the quote. This is her letter to the families of PS752 on why they won't open a criminal investigation. Okay? A question, this is direct quote. A question was also raised on whether the decision to not commence or lead a domestic criminal investigation in Canada was an RCMP decision. It is indeed our responsibility to make these decisions. Though, okay, we got a pivot word. Though what? Though we consult with legal counsel, okay, That kind of makes sense, right? You want to make sure you're not putting out too much information that could that one makes sense. Here's the one where it gets weird. And other advisors. Who are the other advisors? Here's where it gets even weirder. On the potential viability of obtaining physical evidence, access the witnesses and what? And consider related issues. What related issues? Who are the other advisors and what other considered related issues are we talking about? Are they political people? Are they politicians, cabinet members, maybe? What related issues are we considering? That's her letter. That's the word she said. Does it sound like she's being forward with these families? Though it is our decision, right? It is indeed our responsibility to make these decisions. Though, pivot. We consult with legal counsel and other advisors. Who's the other advisors? On the potential viability of obtaining physical evidence, access the witness, and consider related issues. Back to that comment. Obtaining physical evidence and access to witnesses, right? They said Ukraine was more qualified because they had better ability to obtain physical evidence and access to witnesses. What did Ukraine say? We don't have access to witnesses. We don't have access to evidence. Still, it was not a hindrance to our investigation. Bull crap coming out of the mouths of these people. And they say it with a straight face. And they say it worse than that. These are your, this could be your neighbor. This could be a friend of yours. This could be your own loved one. And they looked them in the eye, said they would fight for justice and accountability. And then they make up excuse after excuse after excuse on why they can't do it, including, just to remind people, that the counsel for the Attorney General of Canada asked that a motion for default judgment against Iran for their intentional act of terrorism be dismissed. I'll read directly. The F10A certificate delivered to the court in this case is proof of the minister's continued recognition of the properties that listed on their certificate continuing immunity from enforcement to judgment creditors. The Attorney General of Canada asked that the motion be dismissed on the grounds that there can be no enforcement against the property identified by the minister in the F10A certificate. They had a $107 million award by an Ontario civil court, said it was an intentional act of terrorism. They didn't even ask to be listed as an intervener on the court case, meaning to have an official place in the court case. But it didn't stop them, didn't stop the counsel for the Attorney General of Canada, asked that it be dismissed outright. Are you kidding me? Not to mention that the lawyer for the plaintiffs on this case said he's found the government to be difficult and to be opaque and to be uncommunicative. Oh, that's not all. He also called the way they were dealing with him government bullying. Sounds like they're really trying to help.
The government wanted the names of the sources of the information.
He refused to give it to them because he goes, no, they're redacted for a reason, and the victim impact statements are redacted to protect these people from the IRGC, the Iran Revolutionary Guard, and them in general. They still kept asking for it even after it was listed on the public record. Quote from the lawyer representing the plaintiffs in Zarif v. Iran, the Belababa case. Direct quote, in the past week, I have received what I would call threatening and harassing emails from the lawyer acting for the government of Canada. I believe that would be Jacqueline Dice-Visca. I'm not sure on that. Might have been another one. But anyways, this is direct quote. He says, lawyer acting for the government of Canada. Very distressing emails. Sounds like they're really trying to fight for justice and accountability. If this is allowed to continue to be in the dark, where the average Canadian doesn't know about it, this is the crap they're going to do behind closed doors.
They're getting away with it.
I'm fighting for you. Meanwhile, you're right.
It's showing that Canadians are not safe, not being protected by those that are supposed to be serving and protecting the public. They are not being served or protected. Not at home, not abroad. We have a serious problem in this country whenever the RCMP are not there to protect the citizenry. They are there to protect the government and the government's political interests.
And this is the full quote describing the situation that short quote was from. It's Mr. Arnold, the plaintiff, or the lawyer for the plaintiffs in Zarivi versus Iran. This is a direct quote. We have typically filed our material directly with the judge because we are bound to protect the anonymity and confidentiality on the public record of the people that we act for, some of whom fear reprisals from Iran. We filed it with the judge at his direction, and the government of Canada's lawyer has written to me insisting that they get our material, and frankly, I haven't responded. They wrote to the judge and said, we want their material. And the judge has basically said that they're entitled to what is filed on the public record. Again, they don't even have intervening status on this case, and they're asking for this information like this, threatening and harassing, as would be described by the lawyer, okay? Emails. And so we did on the public record file what we call redacted material that excludes the identification of our clients or their victim impact statements to protect them. That's not a direct quote. Back to the direct quote. Even having done that and having said that, the government of Canada's lawyer wrote to me again yesterday, insisting on the redacted material. He goes, my response is that I'm more than delighted to cooperate, but it's a two-way street. I want a meeting with the minister responsible, particularly for the negotiations that allegedly going on. I want a meeting with the minister, and we need the help of Canada. We will need Canada's help in the collection efforts to come. This lawyer is acknowledging he needs Canada's help to actually be able to seize the assets that he's been awarded already. And what was the Canadian government's response? The counsel for the Attorney General says, dismiss it. Immunity, state immunity.
And I just want to point out, whenever you're talking about a civil case compared to a criminal case, a civil case, the only remedy that you have is remuneration, so money. That's the only way that they can get justice in a civil case. So if it was going to a criminal case, they might be able to get a better sense of justice. But in the meantime, because that's not being pursued, they've gone the civil route. So this is what they have. This is all they can do right now. And the Canadian government they won't do the criminal. They don't even want them to have the civil win, the civil justice.
All right. I think we're at a point now. We've covered quite a bit. There's a lot of detail here that we haven't touched. And start with the 4-part series. There's going to be more coming on this. And we got 2 things. Guess what? The evidence we are talking about in our part 4 isn't the only evidence that has been out there floating around that would indicate Iran premeditated this attack. And I'm going to play a leaked tower recording that got leaked by Ukrainian media in, February 4th of 2020? Whoa, that's way before the Yaworski report too. And they were in communications directly with PS752. They instruct them at the beginning of this video on their flight path, which means what, Gillian? We've done research into this. That means they had a flight plan. They knew where they were going. They had to get permission for takeoff. All these fun things they knew. That's what that indicates, but it doesn't exist. We found no evidence, right?
Yeah, and the plane was delayed for 57 minutes?
The only plane that was delayed.
Yeah.
How many other planes flew through the same flight path? Wasn't there like 8 or 12? There's a bunch of other planes that flew through a similar flight path. They didn't get shot down. They didn't get mistaken for cruise missiles.
There are more questions than there are answers at this point, and there's a lot of answers floating out there somewhere. So somebody's got to try to get those answers out of the stratosphere and bring it to the Canadian public so that they can look at it and see what their government is doing, and more importantly, what they are not doing for their own citizens.
I promise you the not doing part is much bigger than the doing part. We're going to play the leaked tower communications leaked by Ukrainian media, February 4th, 2020. Long before the Yaworski report said there's no evidence found. Premeditation. Again, we just talked about an IRGC source that leaked that this information, it was December 2nd of 2020 they've had, and that was way before the Yaworski report. But here's another piece. Just in case you think this is a one-off, no, Ukrainian media also leaked another piece, and we're going to get to that right now. This is from Iran Newswire.
Good morning, Crown International 752. Radar identified on departure, flying flight level 260.
Reporting begins with the air traffic controller telling Ukrainian flight PS752 good morning and to proceed to 6,000 feet before turning right.
After 6,000 to paddle.
They then go into another pilot who sees basically what happens, describes the situation, and we'll leave. That's Iran Wire leaked recording proves Iran knew about PS752 shoot down from day one. We don't need to watch the rest of that video. Just the fact that they knew that the plane, they instructed them on the flight path. They say 6,000 feet turn right. That means there was a flight plan ahead of time. They would have to give permission for them to even leave. Then the other pilot on another plane described seeing what he thought was missiles hit the plane. And then Iran said they didn't know about missiles. They didn't know anything about that for 3 days. But their tower communications would indicate otherwise. And the only reason that we know about them is because Iran was actually somewhat cooperating with Ukrainian authorities, had given this audio to Ukrainian investigators who then gave it to Ukrainian media who leaked it. That's the only reason we know about it. That's another piece of evidence. And guess what? There's more out there. There's a lot more out there. We're just getting started as far as pointing out all the dark spots around this file. And I'm going to end with a quote directly from Mirzad Zaree. Mirzad Zaree lost his 18-year-old son, Arad, in flight PS752 when Iran decided to shoot missiles at a passenger plane to take it down with the intention to blame it on the United States. Trudeau, what is the justice in your eyes? Mirzad Zaree, one of the plaintiffs in Zaree versus Iran, told Diverge Media that we want the justice and we want the truth. Mr. Zaree went on to say that he's spoken with Prime Minister Trudeau and Commissioner Lucky many times in regards to flight PS752, a flight that carried his 18-year-old son, Arad. Quote, I was the one fighting with them. Why they don't open a criminal investigation here? I had 3 meetings personal with Justin Trudeau. 3 times he promised myself, we gonna serve the justice. So when I see him, I say, Trudeau, what is the justice in your eyes? Is it the money? You want to sell the justice to me, negotiating about the amount of the monies you'll get for me, for my Iran, for my love? This is not called justice. We'll close with that, and I will say this story will not get out unless Canadians get determined to get it out. That being said, we are working on a campaign right now. We're working on a PDF that will have a barcode on it that will link back to this article. We want people to be able to hand physical copies of this out, because if we're going to get censored on social media and then the mainstream media is going to ignoring it, or is going to ignore it, and independent media seems disinterested at this point, at least the majority of them, then it falls on Canadians. And I will leave it at this. I know for a fact that there is a great deal of Canadians that has been proven over the last few years that care a great deal about truth, justice, and accountability. If you're one of those Canadians, we need your help. We will be putting out this info via PDF on the website. You will be able to literally scan a barcode and it will take you to this article. We need people to physically share this everywhere. Dropbox campaign is another way. We will be running a Dropbox campaign hopefully by the end of this week, and I'll have all this together. Bear with me. It's a lot of work, more than it looks like. I will put out little small phrases that will make it kind of easier to promote this. Then I'm asking people to send this to people that may be interested, that you know may be interested in this information directly. Don't share it on your wall, because if it's associated with me or Diverge Media, it's not likely going to be seen by people in your immediate contacts. We know this. So we have over 5,000 people that follow us on our Facebook page alone, but I'm struggling to get 10 or 20 shares on this article that just blew a huge scandal. It's just big light on a massive scandal no one's talking about. Then I'll share a one-off article on, for instance, the intelligence officer Ortis. That gets 90 plus shares. The only difference, and I know for a fact, is that people are seeing one and they're not seeing the other. We've shared things indicating that we're releasing this story that had 70 plus likes and like 30 plus shares. But when we share the story, it gets 10 or 12 likes and like 7 or 8 shares. We know it's being censored. This cannot be done without Canadians. We will paint the path forward, and it will get done because I know Canadians care. A Canadian is a Canadian is a Canadian. And it is time that those that are not, that don't have a vested interest in this, those that aren't affected by it, it is time for us to care, because if we don't, justice will not be served. You know, Martin Luther King was talking about the Good Samaritan. I'll put another story and we'll cap this. The Levite priest goes by the man that's beaten in the road, and he says to himself, this is a windy, dangerous road. Thieves were known to ambush people on this road. And he says to himself, if I help this person, what will happen to me? And you may say to yourself, if I share this, what will people think of me? What will they think? Well, because maybe the source isn't whatever. Maybe you don't like Diverge Media. I can tell you that this was sourced with an RCMP officer. We've spoken to the lawyers. We've spoken to victims' family members. This is damn well sourced. Levite priest goes, what will happen to me? What does the Good Samaritan say? He reverses this question. He stops. He sees the person in need of help. There's a community that needs our help, Canada. He stops. He sees this person in need of help, and he reverses the question. He says, if I don't help them, what will happen to them? If we don't help, we know what's going to happen with this story. We know what's happening with this story. One face in public and another behind closed doors. It's hard enough. I can't even imagine losing your wife, your husband, your brother, your sister, your family, your loved ones, your life.
Your children, your little children.
But then you seek justice. Your government says they have your back. And they've done everything to drag their feet. They've even asked that a motion against Iran for their intentional act of terrorism be dismissed. Motion for default judgment. They're doing they won't open a criminal investigation. They say have the utmost confidence in Ukraine. This is what's going on. And this is what will continue to go on until this story becomes a headache for the Trudeau government. Here's the next steps. We have this Dropbox campaign. We have this PDF, and I can tell you personally, you're more than welcome to do it alongside me. I will be personally emailing this story to every single NDP, Conservative member of Parliament, members of Parliament, and I'll be saying, you need to speak for them. This needs to be an election issue. And if they will not speak up, I will also be putting their names out there of every single person who refuses to acknowledge this problem, because these people have suffered in silence for too damn long. And it's time for good people, the good people of Canada, to stand up for their values. When we say a Canadian is a Canadian is a Canadian, do we mean it? Will we put ourselves on the line? And that's it. We covered a lot. There's still so much to cover, and we'll close it there. Thanks, Gillian. Do you have anything you want to close out with?
I want people to remember, if not you, then who? If not now, then when? Share it, email it. As soon as we have it ready, we'll get it out there that it's ready to go. And then just share it with 5 friends that you have email addresses of, 5 family members, whoever, just 5. In Canada, outside of Canada, doesn't matter. We need to get this information out to people so that they know what's going on. So it becomes an issue. So that those families actually maybe at least get the acknowledgement that they deserve.
It's a good place to leave it. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Greg Staley of Diverge Media. We have Gillian Davis, Diverge Media contributor, author of Wexit, The Reluctant Rebellion. Check out her book. You can support her by buying that on Amazon. I'm sure it would be appreciated. Until next time, this story isn't going away and we're not done with it.